Hello everyone, you're watching another episode of Military TV. Russian-Ukrainian relations are now certainly hostile, but it's not all-out war. There are sporadic clashes on the front line. Since the collapse of communism in 1991, Russian troops have intervened in conflicts in several areas of the former Soviet Union, notably in Chechnya and other parts of the Caucasus. In April 2014, just after Russia's annexation of Crimea, pro-Russian separatists seized a large swath of eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Earlier, months of pro-Western demonstrations in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, had forced out a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Mr. Kuleba recalled that in 2014, there was a Russian plan to split Ukraine and create an entity called Novorossiya, or New Russia, a plan foiled by Ukraine's armed forces. The conflict zone, known as Donbas, is mainly Russian-speaking, and now many of its residents have Russian passports. President Putin says Russia will defend Russian citizens abroad if they are seen to be at risk. Ukraine has been the target of a number of cyber attacks since the conflict started in 2014. In December 2015, more than 225,000 people lost power across Ukraine in an attack. And in December 2016, parts of Kiev experienced another power blackout following a similar attack targeting a Ukrainian utility company. In June 2017, government and business computer systems in Ukraine were hit by the NotPetya cyber attack. The crippling attack, attributed to Russia, spread to computer systems worldwide and caused billions of dollars in damages. In addition, Ukraine says 26 of its troops have died in Donbas so far this year, compared to 50 in all of 2020. The separatists say more than 20 of theirs have died this year. According to a U.S. special report last year, Russia's use of special forces, cyber warfare, and propaganda in this and other conflicts is known as hybrid warfare. Not a hot war, but not a frozen conflict either. In early April 2021, the Russian military moved large quantities of arms and equipment from western and central Russia and as far away as Siberia into occupied Crimea and the Voronezh and Rostov Oblast of Russia. A Jane's intelligence specialist identified 14 Russian military units from the Central Military District that had moved into the vicinity of the Russo-Ukrainian border, and called it the largest unannounced military movement since the 2014 invasion of Crimea. By April 9th, the head of the Ukrainian border guard estimated that 85,000 Russian soldiers were already in Crimea or within 40 kilometers of the Ukrainian border. Russia's recent buildup of troops on its eastern border with Ukraine and in Crimea has put the international community on high alert. There are widespread concerns about Moscow's intentions and a possible threat of war, because technically Ukraine and Russia have been engaged in a conflict since 2014. The question is, do Russia and Ukraine really go to war? I don't think so. Keep watching to find the reason why Russia and Ukraine are unlikely to end in all-out war. The ongoing hostilities in the region have largely faded from the international headlines in recent years, but the latest aggravation in the security situation serves as an important reminder that the conflict is far from over. In fact, given the strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia, any solution to the crisis remains very distant. A combination of several possible factors is likely to explain why we are seeing this intensification in regional tensions now, and why Russia might be seeking to escalate the conflict in Ukraine. First, following the election of Joe Biden as U.S. president, the deterioration in relations between Moscow and Washington was expected, with an intensification of hostilities in eastern Ukraine being one way in which Russia was likely to project its dominance. Second, there has been a recent intensification of discussions about Ukraine accelerating its membership in NATO. While this is highly unlikely for the foreseeable future, Ukraine joining the Western Alliance has always been categorically opposed in Moscow. Third, in February, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky stepped up efforts aimed at curtailing the influence of pro-Russia political and oligarchical forces in Ukraine, as demonstrated by the sanctioning of Russian President Vladimir Putin's close friend and one of Ukraine's opposition leaders, Viktor Medvedchuk. Fourth, so far Moscow has failed to resolve the enduring water insecurity issues in Crimea, which it pledged to address by the summer of 2021 after Kiev cut off water supplies to the peninsula. This continues to result in very high costs for Moscow, with some estimates suggesting that the occupation of Crimea cost Russia about $23 billion during the first 5 years. As such, the recent military buildup could be a way to pressure Kiev on the issue. And fifth, Turkey has also recently increased its support for Ukraine and condemned Russia's aggressions during a meeting between Zelensky and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on April 12th. But despite this intensification in regional tensions, the risk of a military confrontation between the two countries or an outright Russian invasion of Ukraine currently remain relatively unlikely. There are several reasons for this. There is a precedent for Putin using foreign policy adventurism to boost his approval rating. Annexation of Crimea in 2014, for example. But the potential economic costs that such an intervention would bring are likely to be too great, especially ahead of the crucial State Duma elections in September 2021. Moreover, on April 15, Washington imposed new sanctions on Russia that placed restrictions on buying new sovereign debt. This is significant because it shows Biden is prepared to back his rhetoric with action. As such, considering that the additional cost of further expansion into Ukraine's territory could be met with even more economically damaging measures, along with a potential derailment of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which would deliver Russian gas directly to Germany, could prove too costly for the Kremlin. The costs of a potential military escalation from Kiev's perspective are also likely to be too great. Zelensky's key campaign promise in 2019 was to end the war in Donbas, so the threat of the opposite occurring would cause an irreparable damage to his approval ratings, which have been in decline since he took office. Despite a notable increase in rhetorical support for Ukraine, the West is unlikely to offer military backing should the situation rapidly deteriorate. No international military support was offered when Russia annexed the Crimea in 2014, and Ukraine has not since become a member of NATO. This would leave Kiev to fend for itself and inevitably incur tremendous costs as a result. In the short term, heightened political tensions between Moscow and Washington will most likely result in the former retaliating against the latest sanctions, with Biden's proposal to meet Putin at a summit to discuss the situation in Ukraine unlikely to occur in the immediate term. However, despite the latest political aggravation between the two powers, the fact that the latest sanctions are relatively restrained, and that on April 14, Washington also canceled the deployment of U.S. warships to the Black Sea, signal that while Biden is willing to stand up to Putin, Washington is also leaving the door open for dialogue. The threat of an invasion and military escalation in Ukraine cannot be completely ruled out. But the ostentatious way in which Russia appears to be going about the matter, against the backdrop of a spike in tensions with the US, suggests that for the present at least, the developments are probably more of a deliberate display of power rather than an imminent threat of war. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more awesome videos.